and salutations, good people. I hope that you are very well. Welcome to The Paper Plane. The Paper Plane is a podcast created and hosted by myself, Colin Masashi Rohahio Ehara, where I interview people I am blessed and honored to share community with, asking them about a book or books that have had a transformative impact on their lives. And in a society where literacy rates are steadily declining, our attention spans and critical consciousness are under attack, and a growing number of podcasts hosted by cishet men consciously or unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity that come at the expense of women, femmes, female-bodied folks, and LGBTQIA2 spirit plus, especially BIPOC folks. This space imperfectly aims to operate as a counter-narrative to those things. The Paper Plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art, art as honest expression, freedom for literacy, and of course, literacy for freedom. It speaks to the planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as a metaphor for the flights that we take as we sit in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers and how these journeys shape us. Today's guest is a dear colleague, comrade, friend, and pedagogical sibling. We met each other last summer when I taught multiple Intro to Ethnic Studies courses at Diablo Valley College, and this veteran educator played a dynamic role in having my back super tough as I stumbled into making a rough transition from secondary high school to post-secondary and higher education. And for those that don't know, I taught high school English for a decade. And I am very excited to welcome our first guest, who is a veteran educator of English composition and literature, to The Paper Plane, a podcast that specifically centers the act of reading, studying others' writing, and making meaning in community as we do so. Today's guest is Fashauli, a sensei, as it pertains to all of these things. Lisa Ang, she, her, Sia, is a Filipinx-American writer, scholar, and professor from the East Bay. After graduating from UC Berkeley with a degree in English, she worked at the mayor's office in San Francisco for 8 years, first as a liaison to the APA community, then as deputy communications director. She earned her MA in English literature from San Francisco State University and taught writing there as well as at Los Medanos College in Pittsburgh. Since 2017, she has taught Asian American literature, African American literature, the graphic novel as literature, poetry writing, critical thinking, and other writing and literature courses at Diablo Valley College in Pleasant Hill. Professor Ang is currently on sabbatical to conduct research on Asian American literature and media and to write her first formal poetry collection. Let's go. So, Lisa, welcome to The Paper Plane. Thank you so much for being here, family. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Great, great. So today is actually the first time on the paper plane where we will be discussing more than one book. I'm excited to learn how Professor Ong sees these two texts speaking to one another. And so first and foremost, so When the Elephants Dance is a historical fiction novel written by Tess Uriza Holthe and published in 2002. It is set in February 1945 in the Philippines during the final week of the battle for control between Americans and the Japanese during World War II. The story is divided into four parts, each told from a character's perspective and detailing events that occur in the moments leading up to the Japanese surrender. Within each part are multiple short stories that contain mythological elements and important themes of unity, loyalty, and the downfall of innocence. The second text is Martyr, and Martyr is the 2024 debut novel by Iranian American poet Kaveh Akbar, a New York Times bestseller and one of the paper's best books of the year so far. It was a finalist for the 2024 Waterstone's debut fiction prize, and the novel follows Cyrus, a queer Muslim Iranian American poet and writer dealing with depression and addiction and struggling to cope with the death of his parents. Please note, y'all, that spoilers will abound in this episode, and also as a content warning, we will be discussing the following themes as it pertains to this work, and that is all considering that we get to each of them, but we are being aspirational here in this moment. And those themes are language and expression in each of these works, teaching Asian American and post-colonial literature, Asian American identity in contemporary post-colonial literature, transnational connections and or disconnections, immigrant narratives, trauma and healing in an Asian American context, and folklore, mythology, and resistance. Um, Thank you for my long-winded intro. And my opening question for you, Professor Ang, is what made you choose these two texts specifically for us to discuss today on the paper plane? And what journeys would you say that they've taken you on?
Thanks, Colin. So you and I have talked a lot about literature, a lot about these two texts. And as you mentioned, and as you know, I'm currently immersed in this deep dive into API American literature and having to consider all that that could possibly entail. So it's required some questioning of the genre itself and how that has been formed. And along the way, I've affirmed a couple of truths that I think connect to these books. And the first is that, in my opinion, Filipinx Americans are particularly predisposed to a critical consciousness and a questioning of Asian American identity, culture, non-monolithic thinking. And there's many reasons for that that I'm sure you know and that I could talk about endlessly. But the second thing is that I think if we are to include, embrace, identify with, and read a wide range of what has and what can be considered quote unquote Asian, then there's a need to read and discuss West Asian American narratives with attention to decolonization and critical race principles. So
1000%.
yeah, so texts from so-called Middle East and Middle Eastern American literature. I think it's particularly important considering the role America has played and continues to play in that
Mhm.
region. And
Absolutely.
so when the Elephants Dance as a Filipino American author's glimpse at the need for mythology and storytelling within Philippine and Filipinx American history, as well as Martyr as this contemporary novel about a Persian American poet's search for meaning, helps us set the stage for a new way of understanding what is and what can be, quote unquote, Asian American literature.
Mhm.
So there's that. And then there's the fact that I just like really, really, truly love so many aspects of both of these novels and how they're written, not the least of which is their ability to create worlds and invite readers to see what Ta-Nehisi Coates in the message talks about as the way that we are entitled to when we kind of need our imaginations, that imaginary worlds, the dreams of pre-colonial ways of being, or the liberation practices we have in integrating that history or the fact and the truth of what has happened. All of that is really important to both these novels, as well as
Mhm.
kind of instrumental to thinking about Asian American and many other ethnic literatures too.
Mm, mm. So beautifully said. I think initial thoughts are all of the amazing work being done in, I would say both, um, fields like artistic fields, like, like these two texts, but I'm also, through the lens of ethnic studies, thinking about the, kind of constant evolution of the field, particularly like, uh, with like different immigration waves post 1965, right? The ways that, Asian American studies, quote unquote, begins essentially centering the narratives of mostly East Asian
Mm,
folks, right? And like moving to this place of, thinking about what are some of the ways that, historical laws, public policies, have pushed us to seeing that, there's potential for solidarity in, this larger umbrella and being more inclusive of like who can fit in that. It was only a few years ago that I like learned of the acronym SWANA,
mhm,
Southeast Asian North African,
mhm,
and just like all the powerful work that's being done, like, and not just like, in the US or North America, but like, folks in the diaspora all over the planet, as it pertains to like a lot of the different themes we're going to talk about, and the powerful yeah, points that you just made here about these flights, about imagination, and want to just, sincerely thank you for putting both of these texts on my radar. I don't know if you remember this, but I remember there was a moment when you would ask me if I'd read, I think specifically When the Elephants Dance, and what, I don't know if it was exactly this, but you said something to the effect of like, like your partner and your children are Filipino. You're like, you need to check this out, and then so I absolutely did. Um, And so when I kind of begin with thinking about, like,
And if it's okay to say, not only that, but as someone of Japanese heritage,
oh yeah,
also
yeah, of course.
because that's part of it being an Asian American novel is the complexity of the history and in a way having to bear witness to that tension and that conflict and that violence
Hmm.
is important and necessary. But one of the byproducts of that too, I think, is one of the ways we break out of that monolithic thinking too, of
Hmm.
how much how many multitudes of stories there are within Asian America from lots of different perspectives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, it's done a lot to really help me, this text done a lot to really help me kind of continue on this journey of unpacking all of the things you were kind of mentioning with regards to false binaries. Because I think that, and we talked about this before, so much of, my frame of reference as a, Yonsei fourth generation Nikkei Japanese American, operates from this place of legacies of essentially being colonized in the context of the United States, right? And also, it is vastly important for me to explore, all of us to explore, right? Like, um, any all aspects, not only about ways that we are tied to legacies of, of subjugation, of being historically dispossessed, oppressed, but also the ways that we are tied to the oppressor roles, right, of all these things. So very grateful for that. Um, and thinking about kind of language and expression in both of these pieces, and shout out to you, you put this quote on my radar. But the philosopher Derrida says one writes in order to communicate something to those who are absent, the absence of the sender, of the receiver, from the mark they abandon, in which cuts itself off from them and continues to produce effects independently of their presence and of the present actuality of their intentions. Indeed, even after their death, their absence belongs to the structure of all writing, and I shall further add on, of all language in general. So language is central to both these texts. I mean, stating the obvious, right? But Holthe's use of lyrical prose, beautifully interwoven narratives, and Akbar's roomy, evocative U.S. pop culture-esque, shout out Lisa Simpson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar making appearances in here, in his fragmented poetry. And so I'm wondering, in your mind, how do these authors use language, and those forms of expression to shed light on some of the vast complexities of the Asian and or Asian American experience in your mind?
Thanks. So that quote from Signature Event Context is one that I included in my master's thesis, partly because Derrida, as someone who thinking of a deconstruction lens, someone who was like Algerian French and studied by Spivak and these ancestors of post-colonial or decolonizing thinking, at least in how I have integrated them into my scholarship, reading, writing practices. I love that quote because Derrida he's breaking down how language is transactional. There's always a sender and a receiver when you write something like a letter, or even if you write a journal entry that might just be to yourself in 10 years, or, there's not anyone that may read it. You're just writing it. But there is always a receiver in mind. And there's something kind of absurd about that too. Like the reason why it's called signature event context is that the signature is this thing that we've all decided means there is this event, this moment in time that gives authenticity to you putting your name there, you writing it in your own handwriting. And there's something really powerful about the meaning we ascribe to that. And there's also something necessary about understanding that we are ascribing meaning to it. It's not that it actually has any inherent meaning. We just decided that it has that meaning. And so that's always present with language, that there's nothing inherently, and this is now the Saussurean like theory, but there's nothing inherently true about a word, the letters, the sounds that they make. Maybe the exception is onomatopoeia, but there's nothing inherently connected or meaningful about the words that I'm speaking right now and then what they mean, how they actually like create meaning in our minds. And so that dynamic is part of the magic of language as well as the brokenness of language. And I think when we're looking at that on a micro level, it's much easier to attend to and observe and feel the magic of how it works on this massive level, like a novel, where all of these sounds, words, phrases, sentences have meaning because we decide that they do. And they have one meaning to the author and they have a different meaning to the reader. But I think that what's also important is that both of these are meta narratives in a way. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is that they make a commentary through having characters be storytellers and be artists and be writers themselves. And something happens for me in a novel when we're talking about writing inside the story itself, because it's a work of fiction, but then it's inherently making some argument about literature or about art or about writing
Hmm.
if the main character is a poet, or if
Yeah.
the frame of the novel, the structure of it requires that you have different narrators, different speakers telling many, many different stories, like is true in When the Elephants Dance. And
Yeah.
so the fact that like there has to be this fragmentation in When the Elephants Dance is really symbolic for me of the many different fragments of the Philippine Islands, different cultures, different languages, people who are from much different places, different indigenous practices that then get sort of grouped together under this nation building that only happens because of colonization. And
Hmm.
so the impossibility of telling a Philippine story or Filipino American novel is trying to honor all of those things. And yet, When the Elephants Dance does a pretty good job of being able to do that because it honors so many different perspectives and also the lineage of like older narrators talking to their, younger grandchildren or, younger people in the community and that knowledge being passed on. And then Martyr has this aspect of Cyrus questioning who he is as a poet, but also as a human being. And there's something about the way this like distracted connective consciousness that latches onto any small thing and makes meaning of it in some larger or linked way mirrors the process of language and the way that it creates meaning too. And it's
Hmm.
something that you can only be able to understand through language because language is always just the suggestion of a meaning. It's not a one
Yeah.
for one set of symbols. And so I think about too with, Ocean Vuong talks about like, oh, I can deal with language because it's so fragile. Like I'm fragile too. And so the nature of language, it requires and it allows for us to just like shape it, wield it, play with it. And sometimes that allows for this playfulness of like Lisa Simpson talking to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in Cyrus's dreams, or the play of, the way that in When the Elephants Dance, you have certain words and phrases or stories that come into contact with each other through different generations or through different places in the Philippines that are all experiencing this like traumatic event together.
Hmm.
So there was a lot in that, but basically language is the tool through which we find meaning because it can create symbols and metaphors and ways of thinking of other things.
Yeah.
And it's also the way that we are able to express those things to one another because there's always a sender and a receiver there too.
Mm. So while you were talking, I was having kind of this vision in my mind of I imagine you're familiar with the Grouch, Baba Zumbi, Zion I.
Mm-hmm.
So do you remember that song Silly Putty from Zion
Mm-hmm.
Eyes?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I was thinking about just like language, as like silly putty. There's so many different things that you can do with it, right? One of those things, the many different things you can do with this thing is like because it's malleable, but it also can be turned into like a ball and you could like bounce it, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
just like this idea of like, the language being like bounced back and forth to a sender or receiver, even if that's just somebody, like you said in the beginning, like bouncing it off the wall to themselves, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
writing something and you are both the sender and no one else really is going to see it, but your audience is maybe yourself later down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think I really appreciate, I don't know, the kind of the ways that you were like unpacking is like absolutely fascinating. I think in both of these texts, just like these layers of it's like storytellers telling the story, of these different storytellers,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it made me think in the last interview I did with my brother David Galvez, he was talking about like how, kind of like in so many words, storytelling when it's like incredibly effective um, that you literally can forget, right, that there was somebody that's like putting it there in front of you, and you like, it's like you fall in love with Orchidea, right? You like you know, and you're not actually remember, you know. And I think you are very good, you know, particularly as a professor of English, like at remembering, right? That this is Kaveh the whole time, right? But I
Mm.
think like, you know, a lot of times when you really get lost in, you know, kind of beautiful literature, that, you know, it's like, you know, it can be done so well that you know, you forget, right, that the whole behind the scenes production is even happening. Um,
I think there's something important about that because I was listening recently to um, a therapist who was talking about the necessity of her clients projecting onto her, that there's something important about um, allowing that process to take place. I think we often think of projecting as this negative or harmful thing that
yeah,
like, oh,
I was so interested to hear
I'm
like
bringing my
more
own
necessity.
projections into onto you or whatever. But I think in that space in which you're looking for, well, but what am I projecting, right? And that that isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but that if we can pay attention to what are the ways I'm projecting this meaning onto this text, or what are the ways that like
Ooh.
this character is reminding me of me or this person or this moment is
Absolutely.
is so important. And I think Akbar, especially as someone is someone who I think in the vein of Coates thinks that's required, that the author just writes it and then they have to step away from it. And the story, they want it to be held and taken ownership of by the reader, because our meaning making processes, especially in Martyr, which is so much about meaning, like that
Yep.
meaning is part of what makes us human. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, in that case, you know, like this often painful search for that meaning. Um, and you know, I think this is a nice segue with you mentioning Coates, and you know, and this is, you know, from your thesis. So you write, words are our way of negotiating the space between our memories and the absence of that which we are thinking. Words come into being as a way for us to signify, commit to memory, and reminisce about the people, places, and experiences of our past. This brings us to the relationship between reading and writing. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates reminds us that reading is a one-way interface, and I'm wondering in these veins, in what ways do you see Holthe or Akbar having an influence on your writing and or pedagogy after spending quality time with reading their works?
Yeah, Coates has talked a lot about how books, the nice thing about them is that they sit there, and that even if you misinterpret it or you don't read it, or they sit there and they accrue meaning over time. This just happened to me recently where I started a novel, I put it down, a friend of mine mentioned it, just happened to mention it as their favorite novel, and then I picked it back up.
Mm.
And now I'm reading it not just with a new openness because this person has recommended it, but I'm thinking about that person and
Mm.
thinking about what they like, thinking about their experiences, thinking about conversations we've had. And I'm taking that into the book too, because
Yeah.
that's part of their humanity and what made them connect with it. And that's helping me connect with it in a
Mm.
new way. And that's what I love about books and language. It continues to invite, it continues to transport in different ways. Even when we were talking about like the journal entry that you write to a future self, like that's a different person.
Yeah,
That's like a lifetime later, right? And
absolutely.
so I think when I first came into contact with When the Elephant Stands, I needed to feel like Philippine American literature had a place in post-colonial literature because that was like my area of study at the time. And I needed that in order to feel like I could be, quote unquote, a master of literature, because that is like the title of the degree, because it was the tool that felt like, okay, I do feel like I have some authority or some expertise in how this is connecting in some authentic way, even though these are all very abstract, indefinable terms.
Mm.
But I think that in this chapter of teaching and writing, I think poets like Ocean Vuong and Kaveh Akbar have breathed new life into what it means to call oneself a writer or a poet. I saw him saying recently, yeah, I mean, at what point is it okay to call you, like we do this for every, if you write every day, if you write a poem every day, if you're reading poetry, at some point it's necessary to call yourself a poet or a writer.
Mm.
And so and yet we still feel like that's out of reach, or that's a little too presumptuous, or a little too arrogant in some ways. But I think that the prioritization of like the particular of like one person's experience is really important and special, and it's something that resonates deeply with me and how I choose to see the world. And that's some of the inspiration for and the motivation to keep writing. And so as it like pertains to my teaching, these are the stories that I wish I had as a young English
Yeah.
major at Berkeley. I am in awe of what our students get to read and enjoy these days, how they get
Mhm.
to see themselves, how they see some version or some aspect of how they identify in literature, because representation is not the only thing, but it's an amazing starting point for some of the best discussions that I've had in the classroom.
Mm.
And so I'm looking forward to bringing Martyr into my next section of Asian American literature when I teach it in the fall.
Yeah.
And I realize now that I have let some of my own imposter syndrome fade away. And as Ocean Vuong aptly
Let's go.
says, like, it's so interesting that we put that on the person that's being oppressed is like the syndrome is like my
Yeah.
sickness or something.
Yeah. That's right.
But for lack of a better term, like some of my own imposter syndrome has faded away, and that's not. I realize it's not just a narcissistic or an egoic thing to assign and teach literature that I just really, really love, because I am the person and the filter through which my students are interfacing with the story in some
Absolutely.
respects. I think I was raised in a tradition where the teacher or the author, like the teacher has to be this like blank screen, this robot,
Yeah.
this like, and now I see that part of what,
Objective.
yes,
Yeah.
objective, this subject to the subject object positions, but also their presence needs to be quote unquote normal or objective. And what we know is oftentimes straight cis white male
Mhm.
wearing the like houndstooth coat and the patches on the elbow. And so
Corncob pipe.
yes. And so now I realize that as a person who is a whole human being, my hope is that my students know that that's who I am, but also that there is some influence in me just really, really loving stories and sharing them with them. And that if it matters to me, the way that that story mattered to my friend and I picked it up again, if I can make myself matter to them in a way where I'm trying to teach you something that will be useful for you in the future, then I think there can be something really vitally important about including stories that have resonated with me and being able to communicate that in a way, even if for them it doesn't resonate in that way, they are walking away with, this is how I communicate what resonates to me because I've seen it modeled in this way. And so um, my hope is that like they have their own private interface with Cyrus and Orchidea, with Isabella and Roman from When the Elephants Dance, and Domingo, a very complicated
Yeah.
character.
Hmm.
And I think the vitality of our discussions and their writing relies upon them having a private interface. But the reality is that my ability to sell them on how and why these stories matter allows for easier access in a world where they could be doing so many other things as opposed to picking up these books. They could be streaming
Yeah.
Netflix or playing Marvel Rivals. Like I think like
Yeah.
Coates tells his students, your peers could be doing anything. So you need to make your writing matter. And so because time is the most irreplenishable resource, I think the war being waged for our attention spans is very real. And
Mm.
so the way that I alleviate some of that is at the very least knowing that I'm giving my students texts that I hope will resonate and that I think will resonate for lots of contemporary, important, relevant reasons.
Yeah.
But at the very least, here's why it resonates for me. And if I can communicate that passion, then there's something important about that.
Yeah, so beautifully said. I'm thinking about, just yeah, just like all the importance, particularly of academic freedom for educators to be able to choose the texts that we teach, right? And it's interesting because I was like going back in my memory banks and remembering like being forced low key to teach, what was it? Death of a Salesman, right? And I think there was some upside in I actually, because I was as a young person forced to like read that play in public, school, West Contra Costa Unified, and was just like completely just like bored by it. But when I was kind of forced to teach it, there were some pieces that I'm like made me appreciate it more.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, couldn't hold a candle to, kind of the depth of passion, motivation that I had when teaching, texts that mean a lot to me personally. And I could see that ultimately reflected in, students' motivation to like want to engage with it because they could tell that this was something that I, felt was very, very important and could articulate like why I felt that way.
Hmm.
Um, but in the vein of all these things, because I know that you have previously taught When the Elephants Dance, and just really curious, excited to hear about, some of your plans maybe about incorporating, Martyr into your teaching, and wondering like if you might teach them, in the same class, just yeah, kind of like really, really open. Like how are you planning to, teach both of them? Are you going to be teaching them both in the same class at the same time? Um, if so, like how might they be in conversation with each other? Or even if not, how might they be in conversation with each other in your mind?
Yeah, I think it comes back to my initial realizations about the connections that exist for different Asian American ethnic groups. But even your example of Death of a Salesman reminds me that when I was in school and had to read Midsummer Night's Dream or even Romeo and Juliet, like I really struggled with Shakespeare until I got to grad school and had a post-colonial specialist teaching me Othello. And I was like, okay, this,
Maybe.
yeah,
Maybe.
this is interesting. And so
Yeah.
um I think there's a balance that has to be struck between these are the lenses, the frameworks, the objectives that we have in this class, and I want to use this text to help us practice with those. And then there's all the other good stuff of, but what are you seeing that relates and resonates for you that I might not even be thinking about? And
Yeah. Yeah.
so a lot of my work is very open-ended because I want students to connect with it in a particular way that's right for them to know that, especially in these books where part of the truth is that we're all fragmented. We're all in the
Hmm.
in-betweens. We're all not quite right for the genres and the definitions that have been set up for us. And so once we get over that, once we accept that as true, what is the criteria by which we might truly affirm I belong in whatever, label, identity, or framework that works for you? Because I think students are really good these days at, calling out and saying like, well, that doesn't work. This isn't a framework that works anymore. This definition isn't really
Yeah.
useful. But true critical thinking and critical consciousness says, okay, so what can we create now that actually is liberatory, critically thought out, does say something that the argument still has to exist, even if it's okay,
For
I'm
sure.
gonna, you know, dispute this existing tradition of thought. Okay, so then what can you suggest instead? And so um, I think that is part of why I have so many open-ended assignments and let them connect with it, find the quotes that are meaningful for them. But those are just my initial thoughts going into it. I think um, we could talk a lot about this, but I've taught the woman warrior in Asian American literature for a really long time. And I think I will still teach No Name Woman, which is part of the woman warrior. But
Mm.
I think Martyr will take the place as the book length text. And so it'll be When the Elephants Dance, Martyr, and then the graphic memoir, the best we could do. And I
Mm.
think all of those have aspects of militarization, war, the effects of violence.
Yep.
And so there's kind of an interesting thread that exists now that I'm
Yeah.
using Martyr.
Dope. When I was at UC Santa Cruz, there was a Maxine Hong Kingston, Jenny Lim dorm, themed dorm.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, you already started kind of talking about this, but When the Elephants Dance and Martyr both explore themes of identity, war, colonialism, militarization, displacement, through distinct cultural lenses. How do you see these works contributing to the broader conversation about Asian American literature, its role in preserving and or recreating cultural heritage and traditions?
Again, I think understanding the history, understanding the massive events that have shaped places and cultures and people, and then getting to the particular of like a person, a character, or a relative, or someone I know that has been touched by that. I think that's part of why Martyr was so striking for me because it came to me in a time of massive loss and grief and processing of that. and for it to be a book about that too,
Mm.
just a lot of stars were aligning, dots lining up in terms of, Cyrus is born in 1988, and then the major historical event of the Iranian airliner being shot down by the US happens, I think, July 3rd, 1988, which is,
Mm.
about 2 years, almost exactly 2 years before I was born. And so he was born in that year. I know when you talked to Em about minor detail, there was some similar synchronicities. And sometimes that's all you need, really, is that, of course, these things can be seen as coincidences of time and place, but they're meaningful all the same. And that meaning, when you
Minor
follow it,
details.
yeah, the minor that becomes quite major in really significant ways. And
Mhm.
so just attending to that and seeing how Cyrus was able to dig into the past and see how his mother, as she knew her at the beginning of the story, is just a number, just one
Yeah.
of the passengers on that plane. And if you read the book, the perspective he has at the end couldn't be further from that initial perspective,
Mm.
just in terms of how he's able to humanize her and know her, how he's able to see, himself and his coming to America or existing without her, not just as this like accident, but something that almost seems like fortuitously aligned in how he journeys through the novel,
Mm.
because it shapes how he thinks about. He's very obsessed with death at the beginning,
Yeah.
and I think that his journey is moving towards understanding that living can be just as meaningful as dying. That by the end, the love that he feels, the connectedness he feels, the things that he learned is really buttressing a new way of being that
Mm.
he wants to live, and
Yeah.
not in a neat, happy ending kind of way, but in a very messy, chaotic, still really, really working through grief and loss
100%.
kind of way. And I think that attention to the like, how do I fit into the almost completely flattened historical event of like the dehumanization of like, we just see that as a date, we just see that as a moment, we just see that war as something that we can't really fathom. But
Hmm.
if I think about my grandfather being in Bataan and how I read this book with the lens of understanding a small, small fraction of what that might have felt like, of my dad being born during that war, like there's some inscription we can make into stories that have characters that are also touched by these like major events, even if they're not in exactly
Hmm.
the same way.
Absolutely. And and I think where my mind is going at the moment is like I was thinking about just how astonishing it is when I think about whether it's the Bataan Death March, it's the Iranian commercial airline being shot down by the United States Navy. Like how many people have never heard of these things?
Mm-hmm.
Even folks that are, our age or even older, right, who were like alive when it happened, like just like in connecting it to memory and like and then I think in my mind with regards to militarization, war, colonialism, what Henry Giroux calls organized forgetting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Folks are actually actively in power who are actively, trying to cut off memory. And then the beautiful, painful resistance of historically dispossessed people to try to fight to remember and put the pieces back together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about that fragmentation. Um, and so so Holthe writes about the Philippines during World War II, the experiences of Japanese imperialism, occupation, while Kaveh Akbar engages with the contemporary diasporic Iranian experience while shedding light on Islamophobia and Orientalism. Shout out to our ancestor, Edward Said. Um, I'm wondering how do these texts work to potentially bridge gaps between Asian American, transnational Asian perspectives? What can they teach us about the fluidity of cultural identities? In what ways do you see war, militarization, um, as the source of Asian heritage peoples' fractures and or connective bridges to one another? Any thoughts that come up around any of those questions?
so many thoughts.
I
It's like
know, I know.
there's no way I'm going to be able to answer all of them
Yeah.
in a
No,
cohesive
you
way.
you were set up for not for success on this, but
But so much. I think what you had responded regarding forgetting, um, and how easy it is to uh, partly because of late stage capitalism, racialized capitalism, and how busy we all are, and that the fact that I even have time to dig into these narratives the way that I want to is such a
Mm,
luxury in certain ways. And I think that the way that both of these stories are really committed to not putting their foots down or identifying in one particular way, that they both have these aspects of fragmentation in terms of um I know you have written about and talked about kintsukuroi, and that was one of the things that connected to me, because part of my thesis work was thinking about the when the elephants dance as my like beautiful, wonderful thesis reader gave me. And she, as someone who identifies as Native Hawaiian,
mm,
thinking about like archipelagos and like
yeah.
archipelagic thinking, that
Hmm.
it has to necessarily be fragmented,
Hmm.
because that is the geographical landscape, that is what's shaping our everyday lives and how we see the world, that is our world. And in when the elephants dance, that's really clear, because from the beginning you have this map that shows each of the different vignettes and stories and where in the Philippines they're taking place. And then in Martyr, that commentary that Cyrus Cyrus is thinking about how Orchide tells him about all of the great Persian mirror art, and
Mm,
how the explorers went to Europe and saw mirrors all over, and then the Shah wanted them for himself, so he made them bring him back. But then as they brought them across the world, they shattered and fractured into a billion little pieces. So they end up making these mosaics, shrines, prayer niches instead. And so really Cyrus is thinking about this, and then Orchide says, I think about this a lot, these centuries of Persians trying to copy the European vanity, really their self-reflection, how it arrived to us in shards, how we had to look at ourselves in these broken fragments, and how those mirror tiles found themselves in all these mosques, the tile work, these ornate mosaics, how those spaces made the fractured glimpses of ourselves near sacred.
mm,
Then there's something really powerful, spiritual, otherworldly about the brokenness
hmm.
of not subscribing to like the superiority of the whole or this like perfect image, but
Yeah.
actually fragmentation is where the human and the messy and the chaotic comes through. And that, I think, allows for this universal connection when it comes to Asian and Asian American, or one specific ethnicity or culture or people or language as it relates to another. Even just some of the words in Martyr that are like they're Persian words, but the meaning is so clear in how we think about some stereotypical, or just for me, like culturally Filipino things
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
And I think that it invites us to all see that, because if we haven't read any other Iranian American literature, it's really important for us to know that that isn't just the one story that represents all of it, but that if
Mhm.
we can see ourselves in it, there's this possibility for like to bring it back to the mirror, right? Like, and I've talked to you about how all literature is a mirror or a window or both, and
Mm,
that it allows for us to like move between all of those different ways of thinking about it, that it doesn't have to be one of those things and it can be all of those things. And we also have to let go of feeling like, okay, now I have it, like now I understand
mm.
it in a way that
Yeah.
feels like
Yep.
final or controlled. But
Yep.
that messiness and that dynamism is like part of what allows us to connect, especially in the face of like such deep trauma and loss and
Oh my
grief
goodness.
that can come with
Absolutely.
violence. Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, and I think, for me personally, around so many of these powerful points that you're bringing up, one of the many reasons that kintsukuroi as like a metaphor to think about, you know, fragmentation, trauma, healing, outside of just, it being tied to my Japanese ancestry is thinking about historical dispossession and, for those who aren't familiar, kintsukuroi is, this Japanese art form where, a piece of pottery has been broken and it's put back together using precious lacquer, gold or silver or something like that, is like the actual kind of like material resources that have been, dispossessed from communities, historically dispossessed communities, and like
Mm,
reclaiming those things, getting those things back, wealth being redistributed or being returned, I should say, right, in order to begin that process, right? And so, um, the beauty in understanding that as we examine, process through the fragmentation that has happened, like not being falsely led to believe that we have to put things back together exactly as they were when, before the rupture happened, right? So I love this,
mm.
idea that you're talking about the mosaics, um, and and ultimately too, like I think like I thought it was really dope how you were, kind of, I don't know, acknowledging earlier the vast fight for our attention these
Mm.
days, and what, and acknowledging, maybe potential, and I'm thinking about academia specifically, where like we have time to like sit and think about things deeply for an extended period of time. And also, last thing I'll say about this is like remembering that, these things are being robbed from us and we actually every single person deserves to have a sabbatical, right? Multiple sabbaticals in their life to take things slow, to really, sit down and focus on what is meaningful to them, in efforts to, grow towards the best possible version of themselves.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
Yeah, as you're talking, I think the question that's arising for me is I think that desire, that search for what feels authentic or pre-colonial or indigenous in some way that is mythological is like almost harmfully mythological because it cannot and did not exist the way that we can conceptualize it today.
Wow.
Is really haunting for me because one of the little vignettes in When the Elephants Dance that I wrote about in my thesis, I think I'm only now realizing why that was like so striking to me because in The Twilight People, where Mang Pedro is like talking about his childhood and how he starts and he says, when I was a young man, our family was not considered the lowest rung on the ladder. We were the dirt below the lowest step. But within our
Wow.
village, my family was well respected because of my special gifts. I was born under a red harvest moon with the birthing sack still covering me. If the sack is buried immediately under a chosen place, revealed to the mother in her dreams, the infant will inherit certain gifts. I had the gift of sight, of seeing those beings that others cannot. I could see the twilight people. And so he talks about how they lived in the Visayas and this ability he has to see ghosts as we might
Yeah.
think of
Uh-huh.
them today, but also just the beauty of that passage and how eco-critical lens would help me understand the connection to the earth. Like she doesn't use this word, but it's like the placenta that he was in was planted in the earth and then he was connected to the earth because they have this bond, and so he
Mm.
had this connection and ability to attend to and observe and be in connection with the spirits of that place. And as we know, the story goes on, and part of the moral of that is that he gives up those gifts basically, like kind of unintentionally, but like he is sort of allured by the developers that want to come in and like take that land and develop housing that then the people who live there can't even afford anymore. And once that happens and that deal goes through, these spirits stop making themselves available to him. And so there's something important about that moral, but I always really connected to like the remorse or the regret or the shame that Mang Pedro feels in telling that story. And I
Wow.
think as a post-colonial subject, it's important for us to know that the system isn't set up for us to be able to feel like we can in some way go back to that or feel right about that at all. Do you know what I mean? It's just like
Mm.
the shame and the guilt and
Mhm.
it relates to what you and I have talked about in terms of the humiliation that there can be
Yeah.
in the sense of colonization
Oof.
and And so I think only when we slow down, only when because the truth is that we're made to think these things are really small and not valuable, but the attention we give, the like focus, the sitting with, the silence, the ability to just give our time and energy to these stories.
Yeah.
And that can happen in so many different ways. It doesn't have to be in reading these books, but like attending to like what's happening in me and my body, in this body that's been, connected to the people that came before me and the lands that I've been connected to. Like it's a huge, huge thing that we can contribute in order to make that right, if that's what we want. And not to say that we should have to in certain ways, but for me, there's always been a desire to do that. And
Mm.
I think that there's a lot stacked against us in terms of how the stories we've been given haven't even allowed us to begin that journey.
Oof. Yo. Um, so many thoughts, but can I share one piece before? Because
Of course.
I do want to get to this next section because I really want to hear your thoughts on it. But
Hmm.
I think um, deeply appreciated the ways that you were like articulating, this kind of conscious or unconscious want that many of us have to return to some pure, authentic, like indigenous expression of our ancestors, right?
Hmm.
And how uh, unattainable that can be for so many reasons, and how, potentially at times harmful it can be to try to reach for that unattainable piece. And then also, I think where my mind went was like I was remembering one of my homegirls years ago kind of put this thing in my mind and it's never left. But I think like kind of I don't know if it's like the polar opposite side of things, but like further away down the spectrum. One thing she said was when it comes to like acknowledging everything that has happened due to militarization, colonialism, all of these deeply traumatic wounds that, those of us coming from these legacies of war, militarization, experience, carry with us, inherit all of that. She talked about internalized oppression as being like, or as oppression as being like literally, figuratively, like a tank rolling over people, right?
Mm.
And she said she said, I'll never forget this. She said like where we need to be really, really careful with regards to internalized oppression is we need to never internalize this idea that those tank track marks that have been left on us
Mm.
like are, um, while it can be useful in moments, like while you're on this healing journey, to like to, talk about them, show them with pride, right? Um, we should never forget that those tank track marks on us were never supposed to be there in the first place, right? And so
Mm.
I'm like thinking, yeah, so I'm thinking about, kind of to bring it full circle, like the beautiful way that I feel like both of these texts in a lot of ways, like does this magical tightrope walk of like not falling into either one, if that makes sense. Um, but
And I think that I agree with that in the sense of it's not for me to own all of the messed up things that came with Colin. Like that wasn't our fault in a lot of ways, but I also think it did happen. And so there's that's part of the balance. That's part of the tightrope walk, right? Is like,
Mhm.
but it did happen. And
Yeah, no, absolutely.
so it was meant to happen in that sense because it did. Like
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the press conference after a basketball game where it's like, well, it was a foul because they called it a foul. Like
Uh,
on the one sense, there's like what ethically or morally we could argue should or shouldn't have happened.
yeah.
And on the other hand, we are where we are and it did. And
Hmm.
so that's the balance is holding both of those in the right perspective, I think.
100%. Absolutely. Um, so both of these works, as well as your thesis on post-colonial Filipinx literature, address individual and collective trauma. Hothe through the lens of war and Akbar's through spiritual conflict, and his protagonist, Cyrus Sham's growing understanding of martyrdom, right? You talked, about his fascination with death, among other things. How do these depictions align with or diverge from common narratives of trauma, reconciliation in Asian American and or post-colonial literature? How might these works help readers, maybe ourselves included, process generational or inherited trauma and move towards healing, even if in small ways?
I think because a lot of the trauma that exists in When the Elephants Dance is connected to war and violence and militarization. And I think one of the aspects that makes Martyr really special is the way that it explores gender and sexuality
Hmm.
in new ways. One of the connections that I see is that Orchidea in Martyr and Isabel in When the Elephants Dance are two characters whose existence in and of itself is resistance.
Hmm.
Isabel because of the trauma she goes through in experiencing sexual violence and then continuing on and having to survive that. And then Orchidea in Without giving too much away, she experienced massive loss and violence, and the abyss gave her art. She became an artist.
Hmm.
And uh, as it pertains to also, especially Orchidea living in a world of sexism and male domination, just like Isabel is, but in very, very different ways, because I think they intertwine in Martyr with like heteronormativity
Yep.
and in When the Elephants Dance, it's more about sexual assault and violence in these militarized settings.
Mm.
But I think a lot of those pains are really intertwined in like what the lifeblood of colonialism and imperialism is and what it perpetuates and does. And
Yeah.
so both of the books show trauma as major historical events
Hmm.
and a very intimate, personalized, individual thing that is so complex to hold and work through or heal from. But especially when grief is this strange thing, and it has to be very particular to the individual, but healing in community or with support is required. And so how do you balance like the individual and the intimate and the thing that you're most ashamed of because it was done to you and you didn't have control over stopping it versus the need to like own that narrative and share it if
Yeah.
that is what helps heal it and bring it into the light and have it be this source of a history that strengthens me as opposed to a thing that was done to me and I continue to feel victimized by.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah, immediately makes me think of the physician researcher, Dr. Bruce Perry, who says suffering thrives in avoidance.
Hmm.
Right, in the ways that I think both of these authors are, doing anything but, avoiding.
Mm.
And it makes me wonder kind of how healing, just writing these books has been for them. Um, but also like maybe specifically thinking about Martyr, um, the the journey of, beginning with Cyrus, like deeply into escapism via alcohol and drugs,
Yeah.
right? And his suffering thriving, right, in that avoidance. And slowly, as things begin to unfold, him mustering the courage and or community to stop avoiding.
Yeah. And the courage and the brave thing being living as opposed
Yeah.
to continuing to be in a cycle of addiction or thinking that what is required in order to form some meaningful message or work of art is death, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you were already, speaking to this, but I was hoping to maybe go a little deeper. So Akbar's Orchidea, Hote's Isabel are characters whose existence is, in a word, as you said, resistance, as it pertains to sexism, male domination, patriarchy, which are in so many ways the lifeblood of colonialism and imperialism, militarization, and war. In what ways do you see these two women, female-bodied characters paying homage to both unjust suffering that Asian heritage women experience at the hands of colonialism, imperialism, and then also the uncanny strength, resiliency, wisdom that so many of the women, female-bodied people in our communities hold?
For some reason, this brings to mind Kendrick Lamar having just said in an interview in which he was asked what it means to be authentic or how to be authentic, him first having to acknowledge that he wakes up every morning and thinks how crazy this world is, not just because, not in the sense
That's
of his
solid.
own celebrity, but because the world is crazy, and for you
Yeah.
to exist in it is a resistance in and of itself. But that makes me wonder. Now I'm like hypothesizing and building off of that statement and saying, is the antidote, or is one way out of that, is one way through that authenticity to the story, authenticity to what you've lived through, authenticity to the you that exists here now, having experienced loss or trauma, is not that person that was there before. It's not that we're trying to get back to who that was, but it's an honoring of that that looks it right in the face and isn't avoidant of it, isn't continuing to suffer by just sort of like white knuckling or moving,
Mm,
steamrolling past whatever arises, because those traumas will continue to exist and will continue to arise in different forms. But and I think that Orchidea, in her case, you can make an argument that as we know her in the book, she is as authentic a character as they come. And I think that's a really like, it's a big claim because there are ways in which she's not being, it could be seen that she's not being authentic in some
mm,
ways.
sure.
But the way that she moves through the world, at least as we're able to view it in her connection to Cyrus and the conversations that they have in the museum, because she is doing this exhibit called Death
Mm,
Speak. Like she is
yeah.
dying and she is an artist, and the exhibit is her sitting in a blank open room just talking to people. And I think there's something really true about what she and Cyrus end up talking about and the interactions that they end up having together, that you could make the case that that's as authentic as it gets, even though you end the book and
Mm.
you're like, oh, I wish they'd talked about this.
Yeah.
That authenticity often requires that we attune to what's happening here right now. And that might not be the easiest thing. It might not be the most preferable thing. It may not be what we think it should look like, but that attending to that and like giving our presence to that is one of the ways that we continue to hold everything that came before and still move forward in certain ways.
Mm, thank you so much for sharing that. Um, my mind is going like 17 different directions, as it tends to do.
Yeah.
Um, well, I was thinking about just the ways that patriarchy tends to operate with regards to these expectations of women, female body folks being regularly expected to be caregivers, right? And so just like the
Mm.
this thing that goes against kind of the gravity of intuition, for any of us that grow up in these patriarchal, systems and societies, of her making this decision
Mm.
to like um, change her identity, escape, and throw all of her being into her art, right?
Mhm.
And how counter-hegemonic that is, particularly when you consider, right, like where, her upbringing, where she, like all the different, ideologies that followed her since she was a baby girl.
Mhm.
And um yeah, I think that just struck me in a lot of ways. And then, when I'm able to like remember, right, that like there is an author who has created this character, it makes me wonder kind of like what has Kaveh Akbar experienced and or, kind of I think particularly like what work has he done as a cis man? Uh, I imagine he's had just powerful friends, family, mentors, who he's done deep listening with, right? To be able to even imagine, kind of a situation where, a character like Orchidea is, unfolding in this book. Um,
And I can say, as someone who has been fortunate enough to have met him briefly, at an event, he tries to take that attention. I think he really is trying as best he can to listen, even on the micro level.
yeah.
And I think that listening, especially as it manifests in Roya in the book. I think about that initial conversation between Roya and Lisa Simpson, and Lisa
Hmm.
Simpson being this like studied at, like smart, but also like girl, like small, small girl, and Roya talking to her and saying, we have difficulty seeing our present selves in history the same way we view our past and future selves. We fly through our days, we move from one decision to the next, only we're not even aware they're decisions. We treat our minds like crowns, these magnificent crowns on our magnificent autonomies, but our minds aren't crowns, they're clocks. It's why we invest everything in our stories. Stories are the excrement of time. Someone said that. And then Lisa Simpson says, Adelia Prado. And she's like, Adelia Prado, yes. And so the way that I'm still trying to interpret that, like, what does that mean that our minds are clocks? But I think there is this like, there's a tendency to think that we have control and are like consciously, intentionally making every decision in our lives, or we are able to form like some reality that is the way we shape it. And those of us who have a certain amount of resources or privilege do to a certain extent. And also, I think there's something beautiful about knowing there's something way beyond that or much messier than that,
Hmm.
because all of us have a clock on us. And stories are what's left behind, but it's also how we move through each day too. Like even just that idea of like, I can control my environment, I can make this decision or that one is a story. That's just a
Yeah.
story that
Yep.
we perpetuate.
Often the fiction.
Very often a fiction, and very often, trauma and loss and grief happens because we don't realize that's a fiction. And then we're met with that reality quite violently at times.
Hmm.
Um, and and that's why I think if you bring it back to like, what does it mean to hold that, or even if you can't at times remember that, to truly like at least tap into like what's authentic for me in this moment, what's,
Hmm.
even if it's just the desire to want to control that.
Yep.
And so um yeah, I think that there's something particular about like the female characters in these books that show how gender, as a woman of color, I think I often am asking myself, how do I know anything is authentic to me when I've always had to sort of approximate myself in relation to the dominant narrative, whether that
Hmm.
be male or white or, and so I think that again, it's just that like paradoxical complexity and the holding of the messiness of like, okay, well, I can start with this breath, I can start with this moment, this feeling, this experience that I'm having, and then just go from there. And I always know that there might be something else at play or something that will interrupt that or something to change that. But that's part of the magic too. And if I can hold on to that like positive outlook of, but I will be able to interpret it and make meaning of it the way I want to, there is that can't be taken away from me.
Hmm. Beautifully said. And I think, this is a perfect, yeah, a perfect moment in thinking about our minds as clocks. And, as Kaveh Akbar says, time being our most irreplenishable resource, we are beginning to run out of time just for this particular conversation today. But I want to thank you so, so much for the gift of your time. Um, Means very much to me. And I have a couple just last closing questions for you. The first is, what is a song, a musical artist, and or an album that you would pair with these books?
Yeah, you had joked to me that for me to choose like a Kendrick's is a song, but
Oh,
actually you say, oh, go ahead.
I was just
Yeah.
going to say, for those listening, this is the day after the Super Bowl, aka the Kenny Bowl, and the funeral service of Aubrey Graham. So go ahead, Professor. I'm sorry.
Oh, and just so you know, our other, our other literary inspiration, Hanif Abdurraqib, was taking questions on Instagram last night, and someone said, "Is the Canadian done for?" And he's like, "Drake will be just fine."
Mhm.
So,
I,
I just
he can just make his bops and he'd be fine. He should have did that. I don't understand. But
But you joking about that with me, it made me think the song is actually Saturn by SZA. There's so
mm,
much in the lyrics of that song that I think about constantly, not just in And the things that I think about constantly through those lyrics are the things that were evoked for me in these books too.
Mm.
That the
Any put
experience of loss,
yeah.
I think that both of them are get at the pain of wanting to say, if there's another universe, please make some noise.
Mm.
If, if there's a point to being good, then where's my reward? That
Mm.
there's something so absurd and senseless about having to repeat the cycle of loss and pain and regeneration and healing and joy and feeling like you've reached some peace with something only for it to then be thrown into tumult once again. um and it can be easy to feel, and I think too, like that song Saturn, SZA was inspired by Stevie Wonder's song Saturn, and so
Mm.
all of these stories exist within a tradition. And I think Coates gave really good voice to the way that we as readers and writers, we exist in a tradition. Like we are not just our own voices, but like if you are tapped into everything you've read or everything that's come before you, there's something about the ancestors, the people who were able to do this work first, even if it didn't look like this, that's really powerful and that gives you some sense of solace or healing in the midst of um, kind of unfathomable and at times insufferable pain and struggle.
Mm. Absolutely. Shout out Stevie Wonder and SZA. And then finally, to close this out, can you please complete the following sentence? People should read When the Elephants Dance and Martyr because dot dot dot.
Hmm. Because you're curious and you want to, but also I don't want to finish the sentence actually. They're meaningful to me. And I think that I would be much happier if folks should just read the book they've been meaning to read that's meaningful to them.
Mm.
I think these are two, I will say, you should read them because Asian American literature matters. And these are two works that I think do a really excellent job of not just questioning and problematizing what that genre can look like or feel like.
Yeah.
And I think all Americans, at the very least, need some idea of that in order to move through the world we live in a conscious way. However, as a lover of literature and reading and writing, I think people will gain the most out of finding the book that makes them not want to put it down because it resonates so strongly with the life that they're living and the meaning that they find in the world. And
Mhm.
so my hope is that these could be books that do that. And that's why I would recommend them.
Mm. Um, Professor Lisa Ang, thank you so, so much for your time, for joining me on the Paper Plane podcast today. So much love, gratitude for you, friend. And yeah, just can't thank you enough.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Um, all right, y'all. I hope you have a fabulous week ahead. Until next time, this is the Paper Plane Podcast, and peace.